How's it going, everybody? You might have noticed I'm a bit shorter today. That's because I'm celebrating Short Day, where we celebrate everything short. That includes short WCA events. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. Skewb, Pyraminx, and 2x2 are the three shortest events in the WCA in terms of how long the world records are. And short events might not always be the most highly praised or have the biggest fan bases, but they do have some good qualities about them that longer events don't have. So let's just get right into it and look at 2x2 first.
So before we specifically talk about 2x2, let's go over some general things that apply to all these events. Well, they're all very accessible to varying degrees, which we'll go over later, but they're easy to get into for newcomers to do. And they all have a bit of luck involved, more than other events, and they all kind of rely on TPS. Now, Pyraminx, the TPS required to be world class doesn't seem like a lot, but it can be a lot when you're actually doing it because of the ergonomics of the puzzle. And so, in my opinion, the three things that all of these events have in some degree that makes them desirable is easy accessibility and easy to get into, fun and satisfying to practice, and interesting ergonomics. But some of these events might have more of one quality than another event, or not have as much of a quality as another event. And that's what we're going to be comparing these by, is those three qualities, because they all have them, but to varying degrees. 2x2 is often one of the first events people get into after 3x3. Heck, some people even do it before learning the 3x3. This makes sense as it's a very simple and easy puzzle, and so are the other ones, but I'd say this one is the one that people often go to because it's very similar to the 3x3. In fact, it's just the corners of a 3x3. So I'd say it's easily accessible to a point, but also it's a lot more alg-based than the other two events because it relies a lot on learning algorithms for last layer and eventually like EG1 algorithms and things. And so you can't get as fast as you could with the other events without algs. And that makes the accessibility less good than the other events, in my opinion. Now, one way that this one really shines is, in my opinion, how fun it is to practice. It is very fun to practice 2x2, and it can get addictive, just like the other events, but I feel like this one more so is very fun to practice. But what about the ergonomics? Does it do anything interesting like the other events over something like 3x3?
It exists.
So yeah, I think the ergonomics is where 2x2 sort of starts to falter compared to the other two events, because it's just very similar to 3x3, the RUF turning, just it's a bit smaller. That's basically the only difference, and there's no centers.
So 2x2 is a pretty good short event, but it has some problems with being not too ergonomically interesting compared to other events. But what about Skewb?
Skewb is an event that it seems like everyone loves to hate, but it does have some good aspects of it that I'm going to talk about. So it's very accessible to beginners. All these short events are pretty accessible, but I think this one does a better job than 2x2 because you can get pretty far without learning too many algs, which is good for beginners. And it's very ergonomically interesting. One of the most ergonomically interesting puzzles in the WCA. I would say it's one of the most interesting. But I think the fun to practice category is where it kind of falls away. I talked about in the episode where I talked about why Skewb failed, how it's kind of repetitive with constantly doing sledgehammers and head slammers. Obviously, that gets old, and it doesn't make it as fun to practice. I'm willing to forgive a lot, though, for how interesting the puzzle is and how ergonomically different it is from every other event in the WCA.
And now we move on to the final cube of the day, Pyraminx. So far we've seen 2x2 and Skewb. 2x2 has some problems with being not too ergonomically interesting, but is accessible and fun to practice. Skewb is very ergonomically interesting and very accessible, but it is a bit repetitive, which makes it less fun to practice.
Now, Pyraminx may not look that interesting, but it actually is a very interesting puzzle, and it has a lot of good qualities about it. The accessibility is obviously very good, just like with all these other events, but I think it would be on a similar level to Skewb, maybe slightly worse just because there are some algs that you might want to learn, which isn't always the greatest, but still very good accessibility. And this is definitely really fun to practice, I'd say. And the ergonomics, it may not look that interesting, but it actually is, because it's an RUL turning puzzle mostly, but there's also these tips, and the tips are very interesting. They add a different layer of challenge to the puzzle, and they're part of the reason why the TPS is so low to get world class, because it's actually a lot harder than you think to turn at like 4 to 5 TPS on a Pyraminx.
So in conclusion, I think all three of them hold up in one way or another. They're all pretty decent events, and they all have different good qualities about them that make them good. But Pyraminx is just the winner for me, because it doesn't really seem to have any major flaws besides the ones that all short events tend to have, like being a bit luck-based and TPS-based. And those aren't even necessarily flaws. Those are just things that I personally don't like. So, obviously this is all personal preference, and you might like 2x2, you might like Skewb, you might like Pyraminx, and that's completely okay. So, I think this was a good celebration of short day today, talking about the short events, but I think I'm ready to go back to normal size. Ow! I think my ceiling decided to be short today too.